Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bright Founders Talk at Temy. Temy is an international software development company that designs, builds, and delivers software for sustainable businesses and promising startups. Welcome to our podcast, where we bring you the most inspiring stories of entrepreneurs and experts in the software development industry. And each week, we interview successful leaders who share their unique journeys and valuable insights. I'm your host, Barry, and today we're lucky enough to be joined by an amazing guest, Harrison Touati, who is CTO at Rhino.ai. Hello, Harrison. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Excellent. And thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. It's our pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. We know you're very busy, but for anyone who doesn't know who you are or the company, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work at Rhino.ai. I'm one of the founders and CTO. And basically, we are a company for automating as much of software modernization, particularly of enterprise applications, as possible. Been into AI for a while. Did a lot of work with software modernization, where did work for large companies and government agencies, helping them upgrade their legacy systems, whether those were SaaS or code. And then my co-founder Adam Branch and I decided we should take the lessons we've learned doing that painful software development, which is often, not very sexy. It's not something that gets a lot of time in the spotlight, but is critical for the infrastructure of the world, right? Like the world runs on these ginormous legacy applications that do everything from grants management to, approval of invoices to inventory management, ERP systems, et cetera, and making sure that those systems keep running and keep being able to use modern technology. So that's basically what we do at Rhino. And yeah, so kind of long-winded answer there.
Were you always interested in being an entrepreneur, starting your own business, or was that something that you just happened to stumble into?
I'd say I was always interested in it, but I was kind of vacillating between two directions, right? On one hand, I was thinking, okay, maybe I want to just work super hard and be an entrepreneur. I was really attracted to that because I've always been interested, in science and technology and having my own direction. And, a bit of a positive, also maybe negative personality trait. I really don't like feeling like a cog in the machine or, just being forced into doing a certain type of work. And so I thought, okay, if I don't want to follow, then maybe I should lead, which is, again, maybe not the right way to think about it. So it was either between that or I was like, okay, maybe I should get the easiest job possible and play a lot of video games. And I decided to go with the former route.
And here you are today, a successful decision made by the sounds of things. If you just look at your career a little bit, like what first sparked your interest in AI? And we will talk about AI a little bit later, but what was the key thing that you thought, oh, this is so interesting about AI?
So the first thing I would say was in college. So when I was, so I went to the University of Virginia, and during my senior year, we had what was called a capstone project, and basically we had to do research, and it was really serendipity. I tried to register for a project. I don't even remember which one I was supposed to pick, and it didn't work, and so I got randomly assigned to one when I went to the professor the next day, and this one was about estimating cultural values based off of natural language processing. This was, there was still deep learning was a buzzword at the time, but this was back in 2012, right? So totally different world. We weren't using, deep learning the way we think about it now. A lot of it was just, vanilla statistical techniques, bag of words models, like Levenstein distance, things like that. And basically, I became very interested in how we could predict things off of data and in particular text-based data. And I wanted to understand the best ways we could build, systems to do that. And eventually, the way the technology evolved, that became AI, that became deep learning, and transformers and neural networks and large language models. And so I was always keeping up with that. I'd go home after work where I was doing, these legacy modernization projects that ultimately became what Rhino is, and thinking about, okay, how can I build, natural language processing? I remember, if you're familiar with Keras, the library, one of the deep learning libraries, I was one of the early folks using that. At least I think I was. And I remember like just trying to figure out if we could get a natural language processing model to, memorize a simple forward and backward string using LSTMs. Those were the hot models for transformers, right? And getting them to go forwards and backwards through the alphabet. And I remember training, models off of like large text-based things. And I was so excited when I got them to finally be like, and just repeating and the. So that was kind of the genesis of my interest. Then I started trying to apply that to work, right? So can we use this natural language processing to modernize? But at the time, what I found was, okay, to really get that focus, it needs its own company. And so ultimately, Rhino was born from that.
What would you say like the most pivotal technical challenge was in your career that influenced like how you build AI systems?
So I think a lot of the pivotal challenges I've seen have not that much to do with AI, right? So, there's obviously folks working on the foundation models, right? And they're doing very complicated technical challenges and mathematical and scientific challenges in terms of pushing those frontier models forward. But a lot of the complexity of enterprise software, and this is, again, really related to what we're doing, is all the other stuff, right? How do you have a scalable, secure, hostable model that meets all of the security compliance and all of the just in general requirements of large companies? It needs to have, hot failover so that if something goes wrong, it switches over to another server and stays up. It needs to make sure it integrates with all the different external systems, so a company, it's not enough to just have some AI model floating out there that you might have to integrate with their ERP system and their integration platform and their, data warehouse and all sorts of different systems. And building software systems that were resilient, secure, and reliable was a big part of that. And so, for example, I did work with the federal government on a large grants management system. And I was probably 25. I got sent in to be like a senior developer on this at the time, go in, through these consulting agencies, right? So, you have all the big consulting firms, but what they really are doing is basically renting out software developers, right? And going through and dealing with this complicated grants management system and understanding the really complicated business rules it had to follow, right? So, they had rules from the FCC about how they were supposed to report, because this was related to telecom. So, how they were supposed to report billing. And then obviously there's like your actual financial rules and regulations on how you report billing. And sometimes these would sort of come into conflict. And this organization, this government organization I was working with, had to figure out how to reconcile that. And so tons of complicated logic was created. And that complicated logic had to meet all that criteria I said before. It had to integrate with all the appropriate systems. It had to be resilient. It had to be reliable. It had to perform well, right? So that I'd say really helped me understand the actual software problems people are dealing with. It's one thing to say I wrote up a little ML model or I got a cool demo. It is very different when you get into the actual world of enterprise software, which is what the world runs on.
What is your approach to like creating AI systems that are both like performant and scalable at the same time?
Requirements. You have to understand what they're supposed to do. If you don't understand if you look up like modernization projects, right? And so at Rhino, that's basically our AI software is it analyzes legacy systems and it identifies their or SaaS systems, or really could be modern systems. Just normally people want to move away from legacy systems, right? And it pulls out their business logic. And this is the core thing that we focus on. And this is why we built the product around this. There are tons of tools out there that can take text and build software. And these are amazing and extremely useful tools. But an example I like to give is if you imagine Copilot version Infinity came out tomorrow. And Copilot Infinity will take your requirements, your natural language text, and perfectly build robust, scalable, enterprise grade applications. This would not solve software enterprise modernization because most of those projects fail. If you look at a huge portion of modernization projects fail. There's a reason that why the government and major banks are still on COBOL mainframes because
Mm.
they have failed over and over. I mean, the developers for these systems are dead. It's like it's not even like they're old and aging anymore. They're literally like, yeah, we have dead people who wrote this. They don't know the requirements, so they can't modernize. And so you have to be able to understand the existing business logic. This is key to building good AI systems because if the AI is trying to automate bad requirements or write code based on bad requirements, it's useless. And so we go the opposite way. We take AI and we say, we're going to analyze not just code because people are very focused on code, but tons of enterprise applications are low code. You've probably, heard that term, right? Or they're ERP based or they're codeless or, there's 100 different terms, right? You have, your SAPs, your ServiceNows, your Salesforce, your Appians, right? All of these different systems out there that house critical business logic. And so the AI needs to be able to scan not just code, .NET, Java, Python, but those weird systems and their weird configurations. They're often just giant XML files of, proprietary formatted stuff. And all of that needs to be analyzed with AI. And then you get requirements. And then you have good requirements that you can use to build apps. And so that's kind of what we're doing at Rhino. And that's, I think, a bit of our differentiator is that backwards approach. We start with analyzing systems to pull out logic. Most of the time, when you think about building an AI system, especially for software development, companies as they exist, let's say they want to build an app for invoicing or for employee onboarding. It's not like they don't onboard employees now. If they're onboarding employees now, you need to understand how they do it and what different technical systems that onboarding process touches and what user groups that it interacts with. And only through doing that can you successfully modernize. Everybody who's going to try to just like talk to a client, get a list of requirements, and just be like, AI, generate something, it's going to fail almost every time.
It's really interesting that you say that. And since we're talking about AI, and we did have a little bit of a conversation just before this podcast started, what do you feel the future holds for AI, in your opinion?
Oh, okay. No, I love this question. And I have a bit of perhaps a
Get
sour
ready, guys.
right? Yeah. So right now we're at a state where there is a ton of work to be done, right? And as these AI tools come out, they're going to unleash productivity and and the areas they automate, people are just going to move to the areas that aren't automated. We don't have the point yet where the AI systems can do all of the software development. Everybody who's used these know this. Everybody who's doing vibe coding knows it helps you, right? In a lot of cases, but there's still work to be done. And the demand for software is so great. For example, if we look at these legacy apps, there's legacy apps that are 50 years old. If we multiplied the speed people modernize these enterprise systems by 10, you would still need all the software developers today. But the sour part is there's going to be a tipping point in the future where it's not going to be at the application layer. It's going to be at the foundation model layer or the agent layer, or whatever the terminology is going to be, where these models are smart enough where it's like, okay, now they really can do all the work. And it's not like, oh, people love to use the example of the Industrial Revolution. They'll say like, oh, back in the Industrial Revolution, people thought all work would be automated and it wasn't. That didn't end up being what happened. And it's like, sure, back then, the machines were automating part of what you could do. When the machines can automate all of what you can do more cheaply and at higher quality, there's nothing for you to pivot to, except maybe you'll have comparative advantage sometimes, right? But so I do think there's a point, I don't know if it's in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, where it's going to switch from these AI systems, helping people be more productive and automating away boring work to they're automating away all the work. And there's really no economically viable way for people to make money. And I talk to this about my friends right now. And like, I have 2 young children and I say, we should be prepared 20 years from now, our kids won't be able to be employed unless there's some like universal basic income or something like that. Right. The only advice I have, and it's kind of sad advice, is we need to save up as much money as we have right now so we basements till they die. I really believe this. I mean, I could be wrong. It'd be great if I'm wrong, but yeah. So I think the future of work is there is no work. We're all going to be unemployed, and unless there's some major social change, there's going to be massive poverty, and it's going to be pretty bad.
And on that happy note, as AI becomes more embedded in products, like how do you balance like the speed of innovation with responsible practices?
Yeah, so I think that a big part of that again goes back to requirements. And I know I'm like on one track here, right? But what is responsible innovation? There's some things that are universal, and yes, you just need to embed those into your practices and your systems, right? Like, is your system biased, right? Is your system generating harmful outputs? All of that type of stuff. But a lot of what is responsible is making sure when you're working with critical systems that they don't break, that they continue to operate. Because in many cases, these things have already been designed over long periods of time to be to be working according to systems of rules and regulations or could be government regulations, they could be corporate policies, right? That are designed to take care of a lot of different edge cases or complex cases where, especially when you're dealing with systems that are approving invoices or doing grants or managing inventory, could hurt people if they go wrong. And the approach of move fast and break things only gets you so far. When if the thing breaks, then the hospital goes down, right? Or the government agency stops distributing social security funds. And the only way to make sure these systems operate appropriately is to understand what they're supposed to be doing. And so a lot of time needs to go into discovery and analysis of how these systems are supposed to be working. And this is where people really need to be focused. And, to folks out there who do modernization work or work a lot of these enterprise apps, I'm preaching to the choir. They already know all of that. But what I see is a lot of folks probably they don't think about it that much in the AI systems that they build. It's more focused on User gives input, just spin up code as quickly as possible. Don't worry about the enterprise context, the organization, and all of that stuff. So I think really strong requirements management, understanding the business logic is critical.
Yeah, and like, are there any like emerging trends that you see coming up over the next 2 to 3 years? Anything that's really excites you? It could be AI, but it could be something else.
I'm very interested in there was a paper I think Jeffrey Hinton was at least co-authored, and it was about like mortal computing. And it was the idea of, I think it was called like the forward algorithm, and basically the ability to have very efficient training of models by shifting a lot of the training to the hardware layer away from the software layer, and dramatically reducing the compute at the expense potentially of the models not they're not in the software layer, than the hardware layers. You can't copy and paste them. I thought that was really interesting and could create a world where you could just extremely cheaply have powerful models running, in your toaster and stuff like that. So I thought that was, that was very interesting. I also think, something totally related to that. I'm interested in that's coming. Is I think people are starting to take, the theory of mind, a lot more seriously. I don't know if you're familiar with like David Chalmers. He's a philosopher. A theory of mind talks a lot about, he coined what's called the hard problem of consciousness, I believe. So it's kind of like what is sentience? An example he likes to give, and I don't know if he came up with this or somebody else did, is what does it feel like to be a bat and use your echolocation, for example, right? You imagine a bat feels like something when it uses echolocation, and I think this is an important problem because as much as a lot of folks I think like to scoff at this, where you're like, could an LLM, as it is today, be sentient? Probably not, right? But at some point, if it's doing all the work that you can do, I think it's a fair question to ask. Like, and so, there's a lot of research about how does the way that they compute and the way that they're processing data internally relate to, how humans do it, and where does it align and where does it differ? And when it comes to, questions of moral patient, moral personhood, where does that matter, right? If they work totally differently, but they can do everything you do, is there some degree of moral patienthood there? And I think you see more people taking that seriously. Some probably in the wrong way, right? Where you see people who are like in love with their LLMs right now, and that's like probably misplaced. It's like, but yeah. So those are two different areas that I'm pretty interested in. AI hardware, and then questions of theory of mind.
What are your thoughts on quantum computing? And we know it might be far ahead in the future, but does that give you concerns, especially in how it relates to security, for example?
Well, I know that there are people already doing a lot of work on, quantum proof cryptography, so I'm not super worried about that. That could just be due to my own ignorance. But I think that, humans are pretty good at going through and, breaking stuff with software and then releasing the patch. This has been the history for a long time. I understand there's concerns about, nation states that have collected a bunch of old data that was not encrypted with quantum proof cryptography, and then now that's going to get unencrypted. There's probably not much you can do about that at this point, right? Like, and probably a lot of that stuff might already have been cracked. So again, maybe something terrible will happen. It sounds like everybody has a lot of time to prepare for that. So, I think they've already known about this for a while. I think it'll be really cool though. I think it's gonna, as they discover more algorithms that allow for more efficient computing on quantum computers, which, isn't for all possible computing, but for certain subsets of computing, we're gonna just see efficiency gains and computational gains. And that plus AI, I think, is just gonna allow for even more stuff. But I honestly, I think that with or without it, even quantum computing never comes. I don't think I think that the kind of the AI future, quote unquote, is happening either way.
I'm moving a little bit away from the actual hardware and the software, but more into like the culture of the company. Like, how do you establish like a culture that encourages like continual learning or innovation in your engineering teams?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it starts with, boring answer all the way down to the interview, right? So you have to make sure the folks you interview are going to help build the team that you want to build, right? And if you do the interview step right, I'd say almost everything else comes out naturally. You don't even have to do much else. Obviously, you should be doing other things, but if there's only so much you could do if you bring the wrong folks onto your team. And when I say wrong folks, I don't mean they're not smart. I don't mean they're not hardworking or they're bad people or anything like that. But different projects have different goals. Different companies have different goals, or nonprofits or government or agencies, and you want folks aligned with those goals, right? And those ways of working. So I'd say the interview and the hiring process is key. And a lot of that comes down to spending a lot of time going through a lot of candidates, even though it's painful, even though you want to you need to hire and you need that person now, right? Getting the right person almost always worth it. And that's a lesson I've had to learn the hard way, right? So I'd say that's a key one. And the other one is just, maintenance stuff, right? Like making sure, are you doing, as boring corporate speak as it is, like team building exercises, right? Like I know people do all sorts of stuff. They'll do corporate happy hours and stuff like that, right? And those, are fun to say, like, oh, we're gonna go out like to a bar and get some drinks, right? But that is a team building exercise, however you want it. You can frame it however you want. So, and I think having compassion, right? So just checking in with people and encouraging other people to, have compassion for each other. I think, and obviously there's a lot of philosophies on this. There's companies that run, extremely tight ships and, are ruthless and firing everybody. And I understand, there's economic pressures that force people into feeling like they have to operate that way. But I think especially with smaller teams, when you're a small company, you don't want to be like that. And I think if you build people who care about each other and care about the mission and all of that type of stuff, you can go a long way from culture.
If someone's watching this now and you're inspiring them, they want to be an entrepreneur, they want to be a CTO, what advice would you give to them when they're first starting out their company?
I think it's a corny answer, but there's a lot of right and wrong reasons to be, a founder. And I'm definitely guilty of some of the wrong reasons, as well as I think the opposite of guilty of some of the right. Right? You want to pick something you're passionate about, that you're really excited about. And that I think will help you. People can usually feel your enthusiasm. So if you're just doing this because you feel like you should be doing a startup, right, or something like that, you don't really care about the idea, I don't think that's going to help you. So if you pick something that you're really passionate about, that's going to help a lot. I think there's a lot of reasons people do things, like corporate or career wise, right? Like it's security based. So like, oh, I want to, be in a startup. That's cool, right? Or stuff like that. I'd say don't do it for those reasons. That's that type of thinking will lead you astray. Pick something that, there's like that Venn diagram of your skill set, what you want to do and what you think you can sell. Make sure you're going with that. And I know that's basic advice, but I don't think it's basic advice that everybody follows.
Sometimes basic advice is the best advice. Like, Harrison, I just want to thank you so much again for talking with us. I know we've run out of time, unfortunately, but it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. You as well. Yeah. I mean, this was great.
Like, the pleasure was all ours. That was Harrison Touati, CTO at Rhino.ai.